Hey, today we're going to be reading chapters 23 through 26 of Serafina and the Splintered Heart by Beatty. We're reading with the permission of the author and the publisher. Chapter 23. Serafina sat down on a log and gazed absently at the things around her. All she could think about, all she could feel was the vision. She knew now that the Logia was where she had died. Died? Is that what had happened? She'd been buried, that much was certain, but she wasn't truly dead, was she? Had Braden saved her? She thought about what he must have gone through. She could never let anyone know what truly happened, or the horrible thing he'd done. He had dragged the bloody body of his best friend through the forest and buried her, and he hoped that she was still alive when he did it. In the days that followed, he must have been filled not just with the sadness of losing her, but with a terrible guilt. As he lied and covered things up, deceit must have mixed with anguish. His body had been hurt, his heart torn as cruelly as hers. After months of sorrow and healing, he must have just been finally finding his way back into the world when she crawled from the grave and began to haunt him. She remembered how her presence had upset him. He had seemed so frustrated and hopeless. Her vision of the night of the full moon was over, and she finally knew what had happened to her. She thought about her body lying in the grave in the Angel's Glade all those nights. She thought about the young black panther she'd seen running wild in the forest, and then she thought about her whisper of a spirit crawling from the grave and creeping through the gardens back to Biltmore. Three, she thought, 3 pieces, my human body, my panther body, and my spirit. My trinity was split. And as horrible as that was to imagine, and as difficult as it was to accept, everything finally began to make sense in her mind. She knew from the stories of the mountain folk that there could only be one Black Panther in the forest at a time. And it's me, she thought. It's still me. I'm the Black Panther running through the forest, and I'm the dead girl lying in the grave. And I'm this lost spirit finding her way through the living world. On the night of the full moon, she and Braden had fought an epic battle against Rowena, and they had lost. She had lost. The damaged black cloak had torn her asunder and flung her pieces out into the world. Time and space, body and spirit, dream and waking, were all a jumble now. She was not exactly dead, and she was not exactly alive. She was not spirit or body. She was all these things and none, thrown to the winds of chaos, like the black shapes still floating in the forest and destroying everything they touched. They were the torn inner remnants of the black cloak. Still stunned, she looked over at Rowena. How did you show me this vision? It felt so real. I remember walking out onto the Logia that night and standing at the rail, but once the cloak went over my head, I was torn apart. I couldn't have seen all those things you showed me. Those couldn't have been my memories alone. No, Rowena said softly, lowering her head. Your memories, my memories, the light of the moon, the slip of the stars. It's everything that happened that night, the print of our movement on the thread of time. Serafina began to reply, but she was unable to find the right words, and she was still trembling from the experience of it. It was startling, she said finally. What I did was called scrying, Rowena said. It provides a vision of past events, a glimpse into the thread. And you've seen it before? Yes, Rowena said, and Serafina could see that it had affected Rowena as powerfully as it had affected her. You attacked me on the Logia, Serafina said, trying to connect everything together in her mind. You tried to kill me with the black cloak. And I almost succeeded, Rowena said. You probably thought you had me as good as dead. I did indeed, Rowena admitted, obviously annoyed. There was no way you should have been able to survive that. I reckon I'm not quite as easy to kill as you figured either. Apparently not, Rowena said with a ghost of a smile. Serafina frowned in confusion and looked up at her. But you still showed me this vision. Rowena turned away, hiding her expression. But why? Serafina asked. Why did you show me that? Because you were starting to annoy me with all your mewling, weepy crying about Braden. But I have always been your enemy, and yet you showed this to me. You helped me. Rowena shook her head. Don't flatter yourself, Cat. I'm not trying to be your friend. I just showed you what happened. The truth is the truth. The past is the past. It cannot be changed. But things have changed now. What do you mean things have changed? Serafina asked, sensing that there was far more on Rowena's mind than she was saying. But Serafina's thoughts kept going back to what happened on the Logia. The cloak was torn, she said, trying to grasp what she had learned. You've been splintered, Rowena said. Serafina had seen it, experienced it, but when she heard the word splintered spoken out loud, her mind recoiled from the sound of it. It seemed too awful to comprehend, that her heart, her soul had been splintered from her body, and now she was in 3 pieces. How do I fix this? Serafina asked. How do I get back? Rowena shook her head. You don't. You're just a spirit now, harmless as a fly, and soon you'll begin to fade if you haven't already. You can't last in this world, and then you'll be gone. We all go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. Serafina looked at her in surprise. It was the passage she'd thought about when she saw the dust in Essie's room. So that's why you thought you could show me the vision, Serafina thought. I'm not stupid, Cat, Rowena said. I know your claws too well. Chapter 24. As Serafina made her way through the forest back toward Biltmore, one thought dwelled on her mind. Before she faded away, she had to help Braden. She didn't know to what extent the black cloak had drawn him into its power, but she had to save him, even if she couldn't save herself. She had seen the violent storms of the forest, the claw-handed storm creature, and the floating black shapes. Something was driving these evils towards Biltmore. Something so powerful that even Rowena hid from it. Was it some dark force in the forest, or someone inside Biltmore itself? Or was it Braden using the black cloak? When she arrived at the estate, strong winds were blowing through the trees. She felt light on her feet, like if she lifted her arms, she would actually float away and become a flurry of drifting air. She was tempted to try it, to keep learning her new skills, but she dared not test the power of the gale, lest she'd never return. Crawling through the small shaft in the back of Biltmore's foundation, Serafina found her way back into the house. Her pa was working on some sort of electrical accoutrement with many copper coils, wires, and bulbs for the summer ball. She wanted to touch him, to just be with him for a while, but she knew she shouldn't. As evening came, Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt and their many guests gathered in the banquet hall for dinner. More newcomers were arriving every day for the ball, and now some 60 people sat around the long oak dining table, displayed in sparkling fashion with its fine Biltmore monogrammed porcelain settings and silver candelabras. She scanned the room. There was an empty chair next to Mr. Vanderbilt, but she didn't see Braden. She wondered what had become of him after he put the cloak on. Finally, just before dinner began, Braden came into the room. He was still limping with the metal brace on his leg, but he appeared fresh and clean, and he was wearing a fine dinner jacket. She studied him carefully, trying to understand what he was thinking and feeling at that moment. But she couldn't read his face. What had been going on in that head of his? Had the despair of losing her driven him to the black cloak? His dog, Gideon, followed several yards behind him, not at his side. When Braden took his seat at the table next to his uncle, the dog went over to a distant corner out of Braden's line of sight and lay down his head on his paws. Serafina thought Braden must have hidden the black cloak away somewhere in the house or back in the flume under the pond, but she wasn't sure. As she watched him talking with the others at the table, it reminded her of watching Mr. Thorne months before in this very room, as he lingered among the guests and their children. There was something in the look behind Braden's eyes that she could not quite fathom, not just the sadness and detachment that she'd seen, but as if he was going through the motions of his life, biding his time, waiting to get what was important. But that was the question. What was important to him now? Was it using the cloak each night? Is that what he longed for? The dark embrace of its power? She watched him all through the evening, looking for signs. Was his skin flaking off his hands as it had with Mr. Thorne? Did he watch the children in the room with particular interest? You have to resist it, Braden, she kept thinking. She looked for signs of good and evil in her friend, of truth and deceit, wondering which side was winning. She could see him doing the things he was expected to do. But was it truly him, or was he like one of those weird horned beetles that wears the shell of another beetle on its back to hide itself? But then something happened. When he thought no one was looking, Braden slid his hand under the table and he tapped his fingers lightly on the wooden edge of his chair. In the corner across the room, Gideon sat up and tilted his head in curiosity. Braden tapped again. Gideon rose to his feet and moved quickly toward Braden. The dog slipped under the table and put his nose against Braden's hand to let him know he was there. Without anyone noticing, Braden slid food from his plate and gave it to Gideon beneath the table. The surprised Doberman gobbled the food down in an instant and looked up appreciatively for more. Serafina smiled. This was new. Something was changing in Braden. She didn't know if using the cloak had turned him evil or not, or to what degree he could control his use of it. But for the first time in a long time, this was the Braden she knew, the one who fed his dog from his plate, the one who would fight for his friends no matter what. This wasn't the cloak's doing. This was something else. Somehow, some way, he was still in there, deep down inside, at least a little bit. And this was the Braden she held onto in her heart. When the final course was done, Braden politely excused himself from the table and said goodnight to everyone. They all wished him a pleasant good night in return. As Serafina followed him out of the banquet hall and around the winter garden, she was glad to see Gideon walking with him. But then Braden took Gideon over to the side door, let him outside, and continued on through the house without him. That's strange, Serafina thought, and followed Braden up the grand staircase to the second floor. As Braden entered his bedroom, she thought he was going to go to sleep, but then he got down on his hands and knees and dragged a heap of outdoor clothes from under the bed. They were dry, so they weren't the clothes he'd worn in the flume, but the shirt, trouser, and boots were stained with dirt. They'd been used before without being washed. He quickly pulled the clothes on and then grabbed the rope out from under his bed. Here we go again, she said as he went out the window. Serafina climbed down the rope to the terrace below and followed him through the gardens. Back to the black cloak, she asked him. But then Gideon came running toward him out of the darkness. Instead of going toward the pond, Braden and Gideon followed a path into the forest. It was a path she knew well, and clearly so did Braden. He was heading for the graveyard where she was buried. Chapter 25. Serafina followed Braden through the forest at a distance, uncertain how her presence might affect him. The first night she came to him, he had suffered such anguish. She wasn't keen on driving him afoul again, so she let him get a fair piece in front of her. She made her way through the darkened cemetery on her own, following the path that she thought Braden was on. But she could no longer hear him and Gideon walking ahead of her. Either she let them get too far up the path, or something else had happened. Suddenly, she felt very much alone. As she crept past the weathered headstones marking the graves, the graveyard's swampy, moist air clung to her skin like leeches, and a low chorus of crickets, cicadas, and other buzzing insects pulsed around her. Long, wispy trails of mist oozed across the ground at her feet. The twisting roots of the old trees weaved through the damp earth beneath her bare feet, and the vines hung down from the trees, crooked, dangling limbs. She had already read many of the epitaphs chiseled in block letters on these gravestones, and she had no desire to do it again. Tonight she was moved do it again tonight, but as she moved among them, the voices of the dead came alive. Here lies blood, and let it lie. Speechless still and never cry, one said, but she tried not to look or listen. Our bed is lovely, dark and sweet. Come join us now, and we shall meet, said the two sisters lying in the ground side by side. It felt as if they were talking to her, inviting her back to where she belonged. She hurried past the cloven man and through the 660 crosses of the buried Confederate soldiers. When she finally made it through the graveyard, she came to the small open area of the Angel's Glade. She found Braden lying, stretched out, face down in the dirt, on the dirt mound of her grave. His body was flat to the ground. His left leg was straight, but his right leg was bent beside him, clenched in the metal brace. His arms were up around his head, and his fingers of his hands splayed, as if he had been holding the earth. Gideon lay flat on the ground a few feet away, just as still as he. Serafina's heart filled with fear, for it looked like they were both dead. She couldn't breathe. But then Braden's head moved, and Serafina exhaled in relief. Braden's eyes were closed, and his face filled with sadness. But he was alive. He had come to visit her, to sleep there on the ground outstretched on her grave. She noticed the dried stains on his trousers and the old dirt on his boots. He'd been here before, many times. He hadn't been sneaking out of the house every night to use the black cloak. He'd been coming here. She imagined him coming out here night after night, sleeping on her grave when his family thought he was home in his bed. Had Mr. Vanderbilt come during the night with a search party and looked upon his nephew in dread? Was that why Mr. Vanderbilt had been so concerned about him? Was that why he told Braden that he had double locked Biltmore's doors? And Braden lay on her grave. As Braden lay on her grave, his shoulders moved with a slow and troubled breathing. She gazed upon him in sadness, pursing her lips as she felt a thickness catching in her throat. For a long time, he did not speak or move from the grave. He just lay there in the dirt. It was as if his thoughts had overwhelmed him and he'd collapsed there. She moved closer to him, her chest rising and falling, slow and steady, with every breath she took, and she knelt down beside him. She could see that his hands were trembling. She studied his face with his closed eyes. When he squeezed his eyes shut even tighter, she watched a tear roll down his cheek, fall and drop into the dirt. Tiny specks of dust floated into the air around where it fell. She pulled in a sudden heaving breath of emotion and tried to let it out with a measured calm, but her sigh was ragged. When he finally lifted his face, he looked up at the stone angel. "I gave her to you," he said, his voice shaking. "But what have you done?" Serafina felt a storm of dizziness passing through her. Tears welled up in her eyes. As she looked around the gravesite, she noticed that the mound of dirt he was lying on seemed strangely undisturbed. She was surprised that the broken boards of the coffin weren't sticking up out of the ground where she had crawled out. "What do you want me to do?" Braden shouted desperately at the angel. "Tell me what to do." She wished she could reach out to him, somehow touch him, somehow talk to him. "I'm here, Braden," she said. "I'm here." She put her hand on his. She could not truly feel the living warmth of his hand, and it was clear that he could not feel her. The closeness of her spirit seemed to rack him with new grief. His face contorted with a dark and terrible sorrow. Horrified by what she was doing to him, she quickly rose to her feet and stepped back. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice weak. "I'm not going to leave you, Serafina," he said, getting himself onto his feet. "I'm not going to abandon you." He hadn't heard her words. He was still speaking to her in the grave, but it pulled at her heart. She desperately wanted to show him a sign that she had heard him. No matter what had happened, they were still friends. They were still together. Her death wasn't going to be the end of them. It couldn't be. She looked around her, determined to find a way to communicate with him. Dust to dust, she thought. Of earth they were made, and into earth they returned. That was what was happening to her. She was returning, but for the moment there was still a little trace of her that lingered in the world. Harmless as a fly, Serafina thought, but even a fly can do things. And she now had an idea. Wanting to make as big a movement as possible, she stepped out onto the mound of the grave and spun around in a circle, shouting and kicking, jumping up and down, trying to make every kind of wild commotion she possibly could. But nothing happened. The dirt didn't move. She was useless. But then she remembered. Play the flute. She got down onto her hands and knees, leaned down, pulled some air into her lungs, and blew out a gentle, perfect breath, just like she'd practiced. Suddenly, a tiny flurry of dust swirled up in the moonlight in front of Braden. She cheered with a great shout. She'd done just the way she'd practiced, and at just the right moment. But Braden did not see it. She had accomplished nothing. More discouraged than ever, she flopped on the ground. The whole thing was hopeless. But then she noticed that Gideon sat up and was looking in her direction. His ears were perked up and his eyes alert. He wasn't looking at her, but at the dust she had stirred. He was staring straight at it. He tilted his head quizzically. "It's me, Gideon," she shouted. She blew into the dirt again, and another little cloud of dust curled up. Gideon rose slowly to his 4 feet. He tilted his head, trying to uncover what he was seeing. "I'm alive, Gideon," she shouted. Finally, Gideon barked in recognition, but then he started digging. Serafina pulled back in surprise, startled. She wasn't sure what she had been expecting, but she definitely didn't think the silly dog would dig. But she didn't know how to stop him. Gideon dug furiously with his front paws, throwing a rooster tail of dirt behind him. Startled and spitting out the flying dirt hitting his face, Braden scrambled out of the way. "What's going on?" he asked in confusion. "What are you doing, boy?" But Gideon just kept digging straight down into Serafina's grave, throwing dirt like he was a steam-powered digging machine. "Stop, Gideon, don't!" Braden commanded him. He grabbed the dog by the shoulders and tried to hold him back, but the boy was no match for the dog's strength. "What are you doing?" Braden demanded, his voice filled with worry and fear. "Don't do this. We can't do this." Serafina knew he was scared of what anyone would be scared of digging up a grave, that he'd find her grotesque, putrefied body. But Gideon didn't stop. He just kept digging. Braden stepped back, obviously unsure what to do. He watched as his dog dug a deeper and deeper hole. Serafina could tell by the horrified look on Braden's face that he didn't think he was prepared to see what he was about to see. And yet, at the same time, there was something tearing at him, some macabre curiosity, some overwhelming desire for Gideon to keep going. They had to change the dark and terrible world they'd been living in. They had to do something, and now Gideon was doing it. Braden dropped down to his knees and started digging at Gideon's side. He clawed rapidly at the earth with his bare hands, throwing the dirt behind him. Serafina didn't know what they were going to find in the grave. Would there be an actual body? But she'd crawled out. She'd been walking through the world. There couldn't be a body in the grave. But was there? Where were they going to find her corpse rotting in the dirt? She could imagine her gray, decaying skin hanging from the broken white bones of her earthly remains. When Braden and Gideon finally reached the coffin, Serafina was surprised to see the lid was unbroken and still in place. Brushing aside the last of the dirt, Braden pried the coffin's lid away. Serafina gasped in astonishment at what she saw. Her body was lying in... chapter 26. Her body was lying in the coffin. She knew she should have expected it, but there was no way to prepare for it. She closed her eyes and shrunk away from the sight of it, bending at her waist and grabbing onto a tree to keep from falling over or collapsing to her knees. She covered her face and eyes with her other hand and struggled to pull in steady breaths of air. But with what lungs, what air? It felt as if her whole world was collapsing in on her. How could this be? How could she be in the grave? She didn't want to look at the body, but she knew she must. She slowly turned and looked at it again. Her nose and mouth wrinkled as she expected to see her body's rotten skin peeling back from her bones. But her body wasn't rotten. Her body was facing upward with her eyes closed, her hands neatly lying one over the other on her chest, like someone had laid her there with respect and care. And as she looked closer, she could see that some dirt had spilled into the grave onto her, but her face and body were not rotted. She was not a grotesque corpse. She appeared to be in some form of suspended animation, as if she lay in eternal spring. Braden had brought her here to the Angel's Glade, where decay and seasons and the cycle of the universe had no sway. Serafina stood over her own grave and stared down into the coffin at her body in disbelief. Braden and Gideon stood beside her. Her body was clearly dead, in that there was no life in her, no breathing or movement, and yet her body was not blue or grayish of skin or decayed in any way. It seemed perfectly protected there, as if nothing would ever harm it. Serafina studied Braden's expression. He did not seem surprised that her body was in the coffin. He seemed to expect that. He had put her there. But his eyes were wide and his face filled with a shock about something else. "All the wounds are healed," Braden said in amazement. Her dress was badly torn and stained with old blood, but her body was in perfect condition. He turned and looked up at the angel. "You healed her," he said, almost apologetically after the accusations he'd slung at her earlier that night. "You've been protecting her," he said as he wiped tears of relief from his eyes. Serafina gazed all around the Angel's Glade, with its beautiful, peaceful willow trees and its lovely green grass. It had always been this way, winter, spring, summer, and fall. Braden looked up at the angel again and spoke to her as if she was not only a living sentient, but a true friend. "But what do I do now? How do I help her?" He looked at the angel expectantly, but after a long time his excitement faded and some of his old sadness returned. Don't give up hope, Serafina whispered. Finally, he laid himself down on the dirt next to her open grave, like he himself was dead. I'm not going to lose hope, Serafina, he said. Somehow I'm going to get you out of here. She knew he hadn't truly hurt her. They had been feeling the same thing at the same time. Serafina gazed down at Braden, lying beside the grave, and she tried to understand it all. Her human body lay in the coffin. Her panther body was out in the forest, a wild animal. Her restless spirit had crawled out of the grave, carrying with it all the trappings and constraints she remembered of the physical world, the steadiness of the earth, the challenges of the physical obstructions, the essence of sight and sound and feeling, pain and hunger and sleep. But it had left her body behind, like a cicada crawling out of its dried shell. Her spirit had made it all the way to Biltmore and haunted those within. And now she was back again. Her spirit was here once more. For a long time, she just tried to understand the difference between thought and action, between dream and waking, between the physical world and the spiritual, between perception and reality. She tried to figure out what Braden meant when he said he was going to get her out of here, out of the grave, out of her dead body. But she didn't understand. She didn't understand, but at least she knew now, without any doubt, that even after all this time, after all that had happened, he was still her friend. He was still fighting for her, and he still had hope. He had tremendous hope, brighter than the darkest night. He was lying on his back now beside the grave, and his eyes were open. Gideon crept forward and curled up close beside him, and Braden put his arm around him. For months, Braden had been pushing his dog away, ashamed of the boy he had become. But now the rift between them seemed as if it was beginning to heal. Serafina was glad to see them together. But why was it happening here and now? What had changed? As Braden stared up through the opening in the trees, she wondered what he was looking at. What was he thinking about at that moment? She went over to him. She did not go near the dead body lying in the grave. She was scared of what might happen if she did that. But she went to his other side. As she moved, she noticed a pair of yellow eyes staring at her from the shadows. The cat's black fur was nearly invisible in the darkness, but Serafina could see the panther's face and the outline of her ears. The panther had crept up close and was lying down now, still and quiet, gazing into the glade toward them. Serafina slowly made her way over to Braden and lay down in the dirt next to him. Lying on her back beside him, she gazed up through the opening of the angel's glade into the nighttime sky. She and Braden were looking up at the stars just like they had when they used to lie on Biltmore's rooftop together. Those nights seemed so long ago now, like they had been a dream. But it had all been real, and somehow this was too. Lying side by side, they gazed up at the crystalline black ceiling of the midnight sky. It was a beautifully clear night. They could see thousands of points of light splayed above them, clusters of many stars, Saturn and Mars and Jupiter glowing in all their glory, and the bright swath of the Milky Way galaxy splashed across the glistening heavens. They watched the stars and the planets sliding slowly over their heads, marking time so precisely that it was barely perceivable, like a great steady celestial clock keeping the time of their inner lives, showing them that out there in the world everything was always changing. But here in the center of the world, where they were lying side by side, everything would always remain the same. For the first time, Braden did not seem upset by her spirit's presence. With her spirit on one side, her human body on the other, and her panther nearby, all was well again. It had been the terrible separation of the three that had caused him such tear and grief. But now he lay quietly. As Braden fell asleep beside her, and she fell asleep beside him, she began to slip away, not into a nightmare like before, but into a lovely dream. She dreamed that she was a tendril of moving air, flowing from place to place without weight or body, only movement, constant movement, from forest to home, from mountain to field. She swept and rolled and turned, like the music of a gentle symphony gliding on the breeze. For once in a long time, she and Braden were together, and they were finally at peace.